Of course, we're on now our lessons dealing with the 7 churches of Revelation. We're dealing with the city of Sardis. Now, of course, next Wednesday we'll go through the passage itself in Revelation chapter 3, verses 1 to 6. But as we've been going over the last few months, we've been dealing with the geography and history and archaeology of these cities where these local churches were located. And so we're going to deal with Sardis. Then, of course, next time there'll be Philadelphia and then Laodicea. So we're over halfway now through. So Sardis. So Sardis was the 5th church that John wrote to in the Revelation. As with Pergamum, Smyrna and Thyatira, we know little about the origins of this particular local church. And the presumption is it was probably started when Paul was in Ephesus, and the Bible tells us that all the Roman province of Asia heard the gospel. So that's the presumption. Now, it could have been started earlier. We just can't be sure. But round about that time, we would say. Though it is strongly rebuked by the Lord and is numbered among the worst churches written to in Revelation. So it's not one of these churches that has some good points and bad points. It just has bad points. And as we saw, some of the churches, like Smyrna, just had good points the Lord mentioned. And so you can see on your map here, geographically, where it was the site of the city of Sardis. So you can see on your map there, the arrows start off at the island of Patmos. And then, of course, these are the locations of the 7 cities where the 7 churches were located. So you, of course, have Ephesus, then Smyrna, then Pergamum, or Pergamus as the King James calls it, Thyatira, and now we are on Sardis, Philadelphia, and then Laodicea. Now, the ancient city of Sardis is located right beside the small modern Turkish town that is called Sirte. So you can actually see the connection here, Sardis, Sirte. So even in modern Turkish, you can see the connection with the old city of Sardis. So Sardis, like I mentioned, is located in the Roman province of Asia, and as we see it there on our map. So, the geography of Sardis. Now, the city of Sardis, the name literally means red ones. Why is it called that? We don't know. It was located in the area of Lydia within the Roman province of Asia. And you can see it there on a larger map of what is now modern day Turkey. Here it's called Sardis, but that's just another variant way of spelling the name of the city. It was located approximately 35 miles or 56 kilometers south of Thyatira in the fertile Hermus River Valley. The Acropolis of the ancient city was located on the impregnable Mount Tmolus and the Pactolus River, which sands were said to have been golden, acted as both a natural moat for the ancient city of Sardis and a source of its great wealth. So you can see in this picture here, and we'll talk a little bit about this temple here later on, but you can see the area around Sardis is very mountainous, and the ancient city, or the Acropolis, remember we mentioned this before, an Acropolis was usually a mound, sometimes a rocky mound, but it was thought to be impregnable. Now that's going to be important later on, because ultimately we find out that actually the city was far from impregnable. You know, when people say, that can never sink, or that can never be taken, or that can never happen, you know, never say that. Never ever say that. Say it might not. Because whenever you start saying it won't, that's probably when it does. But anyway, unfortunately, these favourable conditions led to the city becoming proud and complacent, which ultimately led to its downfall, as we're going to see here in a few moments. And so here is that temple again, which we'll talk about here in a few moments. Now you see that mountain or hill in the back, that is the site of the ancient Acropolis of Sardis. Now, the thing is, over time, the hill, or the mountain, has eroded. So it used to be a lot bigger and a lot flatter, and in fact you can't really go up there now, because you can, but it's quite dangerous. So over the centuries, the Acropolis, where the heart of the city used to be located in ancient times, has eroded away. So there's not much left of it up there. And in fact, the Roman part of the city, which we'll look at, is over to the left of this picture. So if you were to go to the left, that's what we're going to see here in a few moments. And here's another view of the Acropolis, looking from where the Roman birth complex was. And so you can see the Acropolis here. So it didn't used to look like that, but over time it's just eroded away. But remember, the ancient cities, and especially in the Mediterranean, Greek or Roman, were often had their heart of the city on top of the Acropolis, and then the rest of the city was around it. So this is no exception. So we'll see this here in a few moments. So you can understand, though, why people thought that this particular city was impregnable. Because even if they took the lower part of the city, you could probably still survive on top of it. But like I said, when you start saying things like, oh, that can never happen, well, that's probably the time when it's going to happen. Now, the history of Sardis. Now, the history of this Lydian city stretches back to at least 1400 BC. But little is known about the early history of the city. So at least 1400. Now, it could go back further, but we can't be sure. Now, Herodotus, the 5th century Greek historian, claimed that a dynasty called the Heraclids ruled from Sardis for 505 years and had, during that time, 55 kings during its earliest existence. Now, whether that's true or not, we don't know for sure. The final king of this long dynasty, according to Herodotus, was a man called Andalus. Now, supposedly this king had bragged to his servant, Gyges, about his wife's great beauty. The king persuaded Gyges to then hide behind a curtain in her room and secretly watch her undress. Well, she found out. She literally found Gyges peeking on her. And she made Gyges an offer. He could either, 1, kill himself, or 2, kill her husband, marry her, and become the new king. Kill yourself, or murder my boss, marry you, and become king. Now, of course, this isn't a moral tale. We're not saying that this is a Christian story or ever, because all options are bad options here. But guess what Gyges did? He chose the latter. In other words, he said, look, I like my boss, but I like my life, and hey, you're beautiful, and if I marry you, I'll be king. So hey, what's the little regicide, when I can become the new king? So Gyges was apparently the king of the Mermenid dynasty in 680 BC. So apparently he's the one who started off this new dynasty in Sardis. Now, whether that's true or not, we don't know for sure. Could it be? Well, yeah, of course. Sometimes we think, no, that's too strange. But sometimes fact is stranger than fiction. Sometimes very weird things happen in this world. And just because it's strange doesn't mean it couldn't have happened. Maybe it apparently happened, as Herodotus mentions. Maybe it's a total fabrication. We just don't know. But anyway, it's an interesting story. What would you do in that situation? Don't know. It'd be difficult, wouldn't it? But you can see here what choice did he have, really? But anyway, in 561 BC, the famous Mermenid king Croesus began to reign in Sardis. He was extremely wealthy from the gold that came from the Pactolus River. Legend states that this river and its sands were made golden by the touch of King Midas. Now, you've probably heard the legend of King Midas. Well, apparently, he touched the river, and legend stated that that is why the river itself produced so much gold. Now, that's legendary, that's myth, people don't just touch things and they turn to gold. But the fact of the matter is, we see here, this is how they explained the wealth of the gold found in this particular river. During his reign, the Persians under Cyrus were expanding towards the Lydian Empire. And of course, by that I mean Croesus. Midas was long gone at this point. So during the reign of Croesus, the Persians were advancing ever towards his kingdom in western Anatolia. And of course, this is speaking of Cyrus the Great, the famous Cyrus. So there was constant expansion of the Persian Empire towards this Lydian kingdom. Now Croesus, being a bit concerned that this empire was advancing onto his doorstep, he decided, well, I want to know what the gods think about this. What should I do? And so Croesus sent some ambassadors to the city of Delphi in Greece to consult the Pythia, who was, of course, the prophetess, the oracle, who would apparently pronounce prophecy on behalf of Apollo. And he wanted to know what he was to do. So the Pythia declared to his ambassadors, and they brought this home, that a great empire would be destroyed if he crossed into Persian territory. Now, this is the problem with the Pythia. The Pythia would not just directly state what to do. They would sort of put it in a very indirect way that could be subject to a great amount of interpretation. Even the Greeks understood that later on in later Greek history. But Croesus says, hey, if I fight against these Persians, then guess what? I'm going to defeat them. That's how he interpreted. So when she declared that a great empire would be destroyed if he crossed into Persian territory, well, guess whose empire he thought would survive? His, and the Persians wouldn't. Now, of course, that shows his pride and his hubris. Well, thinking that she meant the Persians would be destroyed, Croesus attacked the Persians, thinking he would win. He failed to achieve victory over them, and was then forced to withdraw back to Sardis. So things didn't quite go the way he had interpreted the message to have gone. So in other words, he's like, oh, wait there. Well, maybe he thought this was just a bump in the road and that he would soon destroy the Persians later on. However, Cyrus the Great, in the winter of 546 BC, launched a surprise campaign in winter against Croesus. Now, that's generally considered an unusual thing in the ancient world because the campaigning season was towards late spring and summer. Winter was generally not done for multiple reasons. Now, the impregnable city of Sardis was taken when the Persians noticed a Lydian soldier who had dropped his helmet over the wall. How did they figure it out? Well, they saw when this guy dropped his helmet over, the Lydian goes down to pick it up. So what they realized is, hey, how did that guy get from on the wall down there to pick his helmet up? There must have been a secret entrance. And so apparently they're watching this guy. He goes back in and they make a note of where this entrance in and out of the city was. And so guess what? They end up sending a band of guys up, and the city was then taken at night while everyone was asleep. Thus ended Croesus and the Lydian Empire. So the city was betrayed by accident. And the once impregnable city was, well, found out to be vulnerable. And apparently later on, during the Hellenistic period, a similar sort of thing happened again. So whether all of the details are correct or not, what we do know is that the city of Sardis was taken by the Persians. And that Croesus and the kingdom of Lydia were defeated and conquered by the Persians. Now, some people say Croesus was brought back to Persia with Cyrus. Others say he was put to death by Cyrus. We just don't know. But the fact is, Sardis, we know, was taken by the Persians. Now, the Persians then made Sardis the provincial capital of Asia Minor. They made it a satrap. So, this is what they would give names to their provinces. Sardis became the ending point of the Persian royal road. In fact, it begins in Susa, but, of course, it could connect up through other roads to Susa and Persepolis, because Persepolis and Susa were just two of the different capitals that the kings of Persia could reign from. And in fact, you see here, this picture here is at Sardis. You see the Acropolis in the background. Here is an uncovered section of or the end of the Persian royal road, which stretched all the way from this city all the way to Susa and to Persia in Iran. And in fact, here's a map. Here's the extent of the Persian Empire in 500 BC. And so you see there Sardis in modern-day Western Turkey. And the road went all the way through central Turkey, down through part of Mesopotamia, in eastern Mesopotamia, down to Susa. And Persepolis is down there. So you see some of the capitals of the Persians. There's Persepolis, there's Susa, there's Ecbatana, and there's Babylon. And of course, this is where the land of Israel is, and Egypt. But this was considered one of the marvels of the Persian Empire. Now, it was apparently stated that a message could reach from Sardis to Susa, or from Susa to Sardis, in 7 days. 7 days. How did they do it? Well, they'd have regular stops along the road for messengers. So they'd have rest stops where, say if he was given a message in Sardis. Now, not everyone could just use this road. You had to have permission. And so say you gave a message to someone in Sardis. The satrapy or the governor of the city needed to send a message to Susa. So what would you do? You'd give the message to this guy, and he'd bolt off on his horse about 15 miles. Then there'd be a stop where there'd be another messenger with fresh horses. And so guess what? You pass the message on. He goes 15 miles. Non-stop. So there's no stopping. Now, of course, you know, you can only go so far. A guy will get tired and a horse will get tired. But with that system, you can go all the way to Susa in about 7 days, non-stop. So that's pretty quick for the ancient world. Now today, you know, you could send a text message and it'd be there in less than 7 seconds. But that's quick. And that was considered a marvel of the ancient world to have this system in place. And that's partly how the Persians kept in contact from Egypt all the way to the Indus Valley and to up towards Central Asia and to Western Turkey. Now, of course, there are other roads too, but this was like the main one, the royal road. So, that stopped in Sardis. Now, later on, the city was burnt in 499 BC by Ionian Athenian Greeks who feared the growing power of Persia. The Persians soon recaptured the city and held it until Alexander the Great took the city in 334 BC. After his death, the Seleucids, the Attalids, and then the Romans each controlled the city in turn. And so here, in fact, you can see here's a picture. We're going to see this is part of the bathhouse. There's a Jewish synagogue over here. This is, of course, a road going down the side of these buildings, which would have had little shops and units along the side of it. So we'll look at it in a minute. Now, during the Roman period, the city was devastated in an earthquake in AD 17, but was then rebuilt with the help of financial aid from the Emperor Tiberius. So it was leveled, it was destroyed, but the emperor gave them tax breaks and gave them gifts of money to rebuild. And guess what they did? Now, the Roman city, which, according to estimates, probably had a population of about 100,000, we can't be too sure, had a large Jewish community, shown by a large synagogue, which is dated to about the 3rd century AD, that was built in the city in the later Roman period, next to the Roman gymnasium. And so, in fact, you can see here, there's actually, this is a picture of part of what became the synagogue building. We'll look at it here in a moment. And in fact, it's one of the biggest surviving Jewish synagogue buildings from the ancient world. So there was a large Jewish population here in the 3rd century AD, and which implies there was one previously too. And this is actually inside part of the synagogue building. Now, this, as we're going to see, used to be a part of the Roman gymnasium, but what happened is this building was then converted, part of the building was converted into a basilica or a meeting room for official business to go on. Then it was given to the Jews. Why? We don't know. It was. But apparently the Jews were respected enough and had enough, clout in the town to be able to receive a building for their own worship, which used to be a part of the gymnasium. So it was a gymnasium first, then it was in a meeting room, a basilica, then it became a synagogue in about the 3rd century AD. And as you can see here, it is a very large building, and it's also very lavishly decorated, well, from what's left of it. But you can see this was a very expensive building in its time, even from what's left. And this is, of course, looking the other way. And you can see down here, you see areas where they would have stored the scrolls of the Old Testament, down at the end there. So the gymnasium's just right here, as we're going to see here in a moment. So there was a large Jewish presence in Sardis, and apparently quite an important one. And at least to some degree well respected enough to be allowed to build such a building in Sardis, which was not a Jewish city. So you have to be, we tend to think that in the Roman Empire all Jews were looked down upon, or all Jews were persecuted, or all Christians were persecuted. It depended on where you were, what was going on. There's some nuances. Jews were not always liked, but from place to place it could depend. And there could be multiple reasons for that. Now here you see an aerial view of what is the gymnasium. And here's where you see there down in the corner here to the bottom left. That's the synagogue building. So it's a pretty big structure, isn't it? And that used to be a part of the gymnasium. So here's the gymnasium building. Now behind here was where the Roman baths were. And they used to have the hot room, and then they had the tepid room, and then the cold room. This was part of the Roman bathhouse. And they would do exercises in the court, out here in the open area. A lot of things went on at the gymnasium, not just bathhouses or exercises. They would have public meetings, they'd have philosophical discussions, lots of things would go on. But you can see the synagogue was right here. So obviously pretty well to do. This is just looking from the synagogue to the monumental facade of the building. Now, this was reconstructed. So, this hasn't survived that way for about 2,000 years. It was reconstructed during excavations of the site of Sardis. So, but it gives you an impression of what the place was like. There's a fine line between, reconstruction and preserving, on just then, trying to rebuild everything. Because you want to give an impression of the ruins, but you sort of want to give an impression of what the place was like in its heyday. And so this is, of course, this is where one of the pools here within the bathhouse, when you go in through the entrance, and here's just part of the monumental facade. An interesting point with the facade here, you see the columns. The way it is built, it makes it look taller and bigger than it is. So if you're standing down there and you look up, you think, wow, this is so tall, this is so magnificent. But it's actually an optical illusion to make it look grander than it is, which shows that they understood those things in the Roman world and they took advantage of it. And like I said, this was reconstructed after excavations. But it just gives you an impression of what this building was like, which also shows that this city was wealthy. Generally, the government didn't build these buildings for people. Generally, it was local politicians or businessmen or influential people who would put up the money for this. And they do it for votes. They do it just for, people be happy with them or whatever reason. Maybe just to bribe people, or maybe they did something bad and, they're going to throw some money at them so people will forget about it. The list could be various. However, the city was also famous for its idolatry, being known for its worship of the Sibyl and Artemis Diana. In fact, the temple to Artemis, and we saw a picture of this earlier on, part of it, the temple of Artemis at Sardis is the 4th largest Ionic style temple in the world. Now you wonder, I'm not going into detail, but there are different styles or orders of Greek and Roman temple building. And what does Ionic mean? Well, if you see a building with capitals like this, That's Ionic style. And you have Corinthian style, and then of course you have Doric style, and then sometimes you have a mix. And you see these even in modern buildings. So this is what we would call part of an Ionic style, and there is more to it than that. But this was a massive temple, and the problem is, just as in the modern world, sometimes they started off these temple projects, but over time, either the money or the will to finish it just evaporated. And that's what happened here. Apparently, this temple to Artemis, one of the biggest Ionic style temples in the ancient world, was never truly finished. Probably they could have just not had the money after a point, or the will to do it, or natural disasters just hit and it just made it even harder to finish, and they just said, oh, forget it. And there were several ancient temples like that. Sometimes they were just too big for their own good. And so the Temple of Artemis, this is just located a little bit away from the Roman bathhouse and the synagogue that we saw. So this is pretty close, less than a mile away. And this gives you an idea here, these Ionic columns. You can see their Ionic capitals at the top. These are massive. Now, you know, it's hard to see scale, but if there was someone standing, you realise just how tall this is. Now, later on, they built a little Byzantine chapel there, just sort of hanging off the edge of the of the Ionic temple to Artemis. So, especially in the ancient world, these religious sites tended to continue to be religious sites long after the pagan deities were gone. But this was a massive temple if it had been fully finished, and apparently it never was. And so just looking here from the front of the temple, looking towards the back of it, and of course the Acropolis is in the background. Not all of the columns remain, but this is what's left of it today. Now, the thing is here, in relation to Christ's letter to Sardis, we see many references to white clothing. So we're going to touch on that next week. Now, this might be a subtle reference to the wool and textile industry that was found at Sardis, which helped to produce the hymation. This was the most common outer garment worn in the Roman world, especially among the Greeks. And you can see a picture of a hymation. So you see here, it's like a long robe, and then they'd have it sort of tucked over their arm here, and you know, depending on probably how hot or cold it was, you would have a tunic on too. But this is the garment, a hymation. You see it in many different vase paintings or in statues all across the ancient world. It was very, very common. Now, this hymation would have been white for the most part. Now, interestingly enough, white was worn during Roman celebrations, religious and secular, and was required for Roman Greek religious worship. And you know, that's pretty common throughout a lot of the ancient world, that if you were to partake in a religious worship, or you were to preside as a priest over particular sacrifices, you had to wear white. And a lot of the time you would either wear a toga or you'd wear a hymation. They're similar garments, not entirely the same, but very similar. Now, this church, for the most part, seemingly had no victories to celebrate, and was spiritually soiled because of what they were doing. So here is one of the Lord's churches who was meant to remain pure for him, so he would be happy and that they could serve him and please him properly in what they were doing, but they didn't even meet that standard. And so they were spiritually soiled because of what they were doing. And if this was unacceptable to false gods, then it was definitely unacceptable to the one true God, because you couldn't do that if you were a Greek or Roman. But yet this church was spiritually soiled. Their garments were not white as they should have been. And the Lord says, I don't accept that. I'm not happy with that. And people say, oh, that's terrible. Shouldn't the Lord accept them as they are? Well, the worshippers of pagan gods in Rome and Greece had higher standards than the Christians did, then that's a terrible reflection on the Christians who are in this local church in Sardis. So we'll touch on the details next week, but there's this idea of their clothing being spoiled. It was not white as it should have been, and they needed to clean up. Now, in conclusion, this church, much like the city of Sardis that it was based in, seemed to have a glorious past reputation. We're going to see that next time. They had a good reputation. But seemingly through pride, carelessness, and a lack of diligence, their condition when John wrote to them was far from matching their historical reputation. So they were living off their past glories and past fame and past reputation. But like the city of Croesus day, they were in danger unless they repented of their proud complacency and began again to do what they had done in the past. So the Lord could be saying to them here, he says, look, you guys knew what happened to this city during the days of Croesus, don't you? How that because they weren't careful, they let the Persians in and the city was conquered. Well, if you're not vigilant, there will be trouble. And he says to them, look, you're living off the past. You're not paying attention. And if you keep on doing this, then I will deal with you because you're spiritually spoiled. And yes, others may look upon you and think, oh, you're a great bunch. But the Lord looked upon them and said, no, you're careless, you're not paying attention, and you're spiritually unclean in my eyes. And so we see how, it seems likely that the history and what was going on in the city apparently is influenced what the Lord wrote to them in this particular passage of Revelation. And of course we're going to go into detail about that next week. But here we're going to finish this up today. So that's Sardis.